to be a little bit harder than people thought. So, for example, there was an unfriendly letter that arrived from the King of Spain where he said, well, you know, you're not going to be able to use the port cities in Peru and Chile for the trading ships of the South Sea Company. And it gradually dawned on people that globalization was going to be a lot tougher than people thought. As the bubble ended, it turned out that people who had been involved in the company had secretly been selling shares when they pretended to be buying shares. It was the existence of public stock companies was outlawed for the next 100 years, and the British stock market did not recover its level of 1720 till 1815, when the Battle of Waterloo and the victory there suggested that you might have a more stable 19th century in which globalization could actually take place. In France, it was a very similar thing, which was the Mississippi Land Company, which was basically predicated on the idea that the Mississippi Territory could be used to monetize all of the financial problems France had, and that basically globalization would involve trade with Mississippi. It eventually included the West Indies, and then it expanded from there to include the East Indies, China, and the whole world. And at its peak, the Mississippi Land Company was valued as being more valuable than all of France. And again, it turned out that there were some problems. There were only, you know, at the time, there were only about 3,000 people living in all of Mississippi. People did not particularly want to live in New Orleans in 1720. Maybe that's not changed that much even today. And basically, and once again, eventually it dawned on people, you know, this globalization thing is going to be a lot harder than people think. And so, you know, as the bubble started to fade, the company hired people to parade around the city streets of Paris with shovels that they would use to mine for gold in Louisiana, and then they were going to head out to the ports in France and travel there. But then, you know, word got back that people didn't really get on board the ships, and then, of course, the stock continued to terrifically collapse. And so these were sort of the first initial examples of this, and we see this pattern repeated over and over again. In the 19th century, the big speculative mania centered on railroad companies and, you know, sort of the new technologies that would connect the world together. In the 1920s, it was basically, it was car companies and radio were the technologies that would drive globalization. And car companies were going to connect the whole world. There were about 300 car companies in the U.S. in the 1920s that were started. The radio company was RCA, which was Radio Company of America, and the stock in 1920 never got back to its 1929 levels until about 1986. And so again, the assumption was if you just had radio broadcasts everywhere, that was how globalization was going to happen. And I think one of the reasons globalization is so prone to leading to these bubbles and booms is that it's, again, such a hard thing to get a handle on. And so it looks like it's going to happen one particular way, and then it turns out to be sort of very, very different. And in some ways, we've seen the same pattern on a very dramatic scale in the last 20 or 30 years through a whole series of extraordinary booms and bubbles. So, you know, in the 1960s, globalization was centered on, well, you know, globalization means the elimination of all boundaries. And so whoever controls outer space is going to control the world. And so the companies that really boomed in the 1960s were companies involved in rocketry and space travel, because that's how globalization was going to happen, according to the perspective of the late 1960s. And then, you know, by 75, people had been on the moon a dozen times. It turned out there wasn't very much up there. You had to go really far beyond the moon to get anything else. And perhaps the future of the world is not really going to be found in the limitless voids of outer space. By the 1980s, you had the boom was centered on Japan. And the theory was that Japanese labor management relations represented a sort of glorious, harmonious Hegelian synthesis that was going to be the best way people would get along, and that basically Japanese corporatism represented the end of history. And so naturally, by 1989, the Japanese stock market was valued as more highly than the rest of the world put together. The land under the Emperor's Palace in downtown Tokyo was valued as greater than the entire state of California. People were taking out 100-year mortgages for 400-square-foot studio apartments in Tokyo that their great-grandchildren would pay off. And of course, the logic was everything was going to be centered in Tokyo, and this was going to be naturally the future of the world, and that's the way it looked. There was another version of this that took place in the 1990s that I got to witness firsthand, involving sort of the new economy and the internet, where basically the future of the world was going to be driven by the internet. This was this enormous technology that was going to connect everybody together. And again, these things are not all entirely fake. I mean, railroads played a role, and radio played a role, and cars played a role. But obviously, it turned out to be a lot trickier than people thought. And certainly selling pet food online turned out not necessarily to be the key to uniting the whole world in this sort of global thing. So these stories, they get very easily haywire. And we have three others that have happened almost concurrently in recent years. And again, I think one has to think of all of them as being deeply linked to globalization. There basically is a housing bubble, a finance bubble, an emerging market bubble. So the emerging market bubble is about the globalization of labor. The finance bubble is the globalization of capital. And the housing one, which actually is somewhat odd because housing is necessarily local, is basically about the creation of these new cities that will be the centers of the future world economy. So the places where housing prices ran up the most in the last 10 years were these cities like Manhattan, or London, or Shanghai, or Dubai, which supposedly would be the centers of this new future world. And so we sort of seem to be having the same pattern all over again. Now one thing that I think, however, is very different about the globalization patterns of the last 20, 30, 40 years, and that's completely at odds with theories about efficient markets, and that markets are sort of getting more smooth and efficient over time, and the bigger the scale, the more efficient it is that the amplitudes of the booms and busts have been getting dramatically bigger. And so if you were to look at an EKG chart in a hospital, and you sort of see, it sort of goes up and down, and then it starts going up and down in a really crazy way. And if you were a doctor who said, well, the markets are all efficient and nothing normal is happening, this is not somebody you'd want to have as a doctor in a hospital. And what's extraordinary is actually just how big these things were. So the Japan one, I think, was the first of the really hyper boom ones, where you had this incredible situation. The NASDAQ levels in March 2000 in the U.S. were without question the highest on any of the number of valuations the stock market had ever been in the U.S. It was further from equilibrium than it had ever been before. And again, I can sort of tell you all sorts of funny anecdotes from being in Silicon Valley in March 2000. People come to your office, they were writing you checks, trying to give the money to you, and then it all stopped very, very suddenly as well. And correspondingly, the busts have also been much bigger than one would have thought possible. So, for example, the 1998 blow-up of the long-term capital, which was basically assuming that everything was going to globalize and all these spreads were going to stay at certain levels. The mathematical models that described how markets were supposed to behave said that something like what happened with long-term capital was supposed to happen approximately once in a billion times the lifespan of the universe, and so well, maybe you can have that happen. It has to happen once, maybe it happens, and of course, but the problem is we've had about 5 or 6 of these things. So you've had the current housing thing. All the mathematical models said it was not supposed to happen. It's again like we have another sort of 10,000-year flood in housing. We have. And there's sort of a number of others like this. I think I was counting. There have been something like 7 financial crises in the last 10 years that have been bigger than anything that was supposed to happen in a given 1,000-year period, according to the mathematical models of how these markets work. So something is very, very off. You can see